Hello, and welcome to the Argyle CFO Leadership Forum, FP&A Strategies for Success. My name is Lindsay Smith with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have some important information to share with you, and then we'll turn the floor over to our esteemed keynote speaker. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Louis Fanzini, Chief Financial Officer. We are excited to have Louis for his keynote presentation titled Prioritizing Security for Long-Term Organizational Growth, Success, and Well-Being. Welcome, Louis. Over to you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And welcome to today's keynote presentation. We'll discuss why this is important, how finance and IT are working together to protect the well-being of the entire organization, and what a successful security framework looks like, and where to begin. We'll talk a bit about best practices and all at a high level, and I'm glad to take questions as we go along. But before we get into it, I think security breaches today are becoming all too common. And I don't know about you, but I was recently the victim of a breach of a financial institution that I invest with. And it's quite jarring when you receive a notice that states that your data may have been compromised. And the aftermath of what I had to do just was not pretty, caused me pain, caused me concern. And as for the organization itself, they lost my confidence, and as well as a lot of money, both trying to rectify the situation internally and pay out damages. So there are some real world issues potentially with cybersecurity breaches. And from the organization's perspective, I also work very closely with our Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, on building a security framework after the data in our ERP in a previous company I was at was hacked. And all 12,000 employees in some form or another were hacked. Their data was stolen. And the changes in the organization were swift, coming straight from the board. And first starting with the CISO itself. That position originally was just not considered critical in the organization. And you think about today and how important information is, especially cloud-based information, it just was not a priority of the board. And that cost us. It cost the organization in many different ways. And it's not fun when this happens. It could be a minor issue, and you hope for that, and you see that quite often, or a major occurrence, as in those two examples. So as the organizations continue to expand, so does their data and their proprietary information. And the concerns about privacy breaches and potential threats to extort, which we've seen very recently, or just obtain private data are very serious. And as a financial controller, as a financial VP, as a CFO, you really need to work closely with the IT department, as well as your board, as well as your auditors, to just evaluate the needs of your enterprise, the needs of your organization, and ensure that your security framework are sound in order to be able to mitigate any security risk coming up. So this is still happening. So if you look at the next slide, these are just some companies that have just have experienced a breach this year. So it's not like it's something that has been in the something that's happened in the past. I mean, some of the names are on here. If you look at the streaming platform Plex, just in August, they had an attack that impacted 20 million users. It stole all types of sensitive information and really caused a lot of pain for that company. Last month, there were cyber criminals that gained access to the communications company Optus. And that was a big one. They obtained data for their customer database of around 9.8 million customers, all types of data for those customers. Harbor Plaza, another one on this slide, they're a hotel management firm. That had an impact of 1.2 records of their travelers. Some other The only one I want to maybe mention is Pegasus Airline. That is, they lost 6.5 terabytes of data that was stolen in a massive amount of data. And it really will cause company lots of pain. Of course, LinkedIn from last year, a lot of us probably felt that as well, but it's here, it's still here. And with all the efforts that a lot of us have put forth, it's still a full-time job in order to identify and mitigate these risks. So on the next slide, we talk about, well, really, this is just a picture, but IT and finance coming together. And in today's environment, you need to work together. Both the finance and technology executives, in many ways, have become interdependent. And they do have generally the fate of the company in their hands. And in some instances, you'll see for best practices, some IT departments have their own CFO. So people with close knowledge of finance, as well as the implications of the IT environment and the new cloud environment today. And I think working together, finance and IT, they can drive the organizational strategy. Has to be lockstep. They should also be very closely aligned with the board and the operations team to ensure that your operational goals are met. And you need to leverage that technology in order to adapt to the business change. Lots are changing, not just security, right? So as more and more companies are transforming, security becomes much more important. And that's where you have to really work together and really present together to your stakeholders as to what your plans will be. But I think as a finance leader, as an IT leader, you're uniquely positioned to be able to work together and understand each other's language to help the organization really build the infrastructure needed to succeed in this rapidly changing world. So why prioritize your security? You see the list on this next slide here. When you're considering a holistic risk management framework, cybersecurity has to be at the forefront. And it is part of a good risk management strategy. And there are two key trends that are happening in today's networks that I think you need to be paying close attention to. And the first is that the IT teams are struggling to keep up with the digital transformation demands. I mean, just this year, I've put in bots to help me with workforce routing for accounts payable. I've put in a new system to connect to the ERP, thinking about changing completely the GL system. So there's so much that's going on, a payroll system, that the IT teams are just trying to catch up. In addition to all of this, we're moving from on-premise to cloud. And you have these multi-cloud infrastructures, and combine that with the highly mobile workforce of today, the virtual workforce, the struggle for IT teams to keep up with all of this is real. And then the second piece of it is the alarming growth of the automated attacks. I just showed you a few. There are many more. There were about 60 large ones this year alone. And they're becoming more and more successful at targeting known applications, known devices, and known network vulnerabilities. So that's something that needs to be considered. And a couple of other points that I wanted to mention here is that there are inherent implementation flaws, potentially. When you're putting in your systems, you may have some implementation flaws that you could put in place. And there could even be design flaws from the big cloud companies that cyber criminals can target. And the final point here is all this could be costly to your bottom line, to your company's reputation, to your future growth and viability as a company in the future. Prioritizing your security, I think, as we'll talk a bit about on the next slide, is where do you begin here, right? Where do I need to determine the best way to start? And the first place I would start with is make it a priority in the boardroom. You'd be surprised that this is not always on the agenda for the board. It may be an annual discussion, But my suggestion, and I think best practice, is to ensure that you do have it as a recurring agenda item in your board meetings. Have it as a standing item. Make sure that your chief information security officer or the equivalent is there. Make sure the CFO is talking. Make sure you're able to discuss what some of the projects are that you're working on for transformation and how you're securing that information and how it's moving along. And it's really important for the board to understand. I think I gave you that example earlier that sometimes boards may not have given this a high priority, thinking that nothing major could happen. But as we move more and more to the cloud, I think there's going to be more focus from a board perspective. But where do you start? You start, I think, with a security audit, and you're just going to identify where are your risks, where are your vulnerabilities, and then assess, give them an assessment, a low, medium, high risk, just to determine where do I have to focus my resources going forward. An emergency plan. So you have to put together, I would say, a pretty robust emergency plan, step by step. What do you do in the event of a cyber attack? What do you do in the event that your data has been compromised? You do it as a short-term view and surely as a long-term view, but you need to have a plan to get your company back up and running as soon as possible. So should there be something where it impacts your operations, impacts your billing, you're going to need to want to get back up and running very, very quickly. You want to be able to stop any of the additional losses that may be occurring. The only way that happens is through a good, solid plan. And then I think you need a good, strong, experienced security team. So that means both physical security as well as cyber. And you're going to need a team that is strong and understands the immediate action responses that are necessary when any sort of issue occurs. And you need to plan on how that's going to work. And the reason I mentioned physical security is because there are instances where some of these attacks may occur on on-premise servers, and you need to ensure that all of the data, all the accountability is included within your plan. You also have to look at your supply chain. Where are some of the weak areas? Where are some of the weak areas where some of this data can be compromised? And all putting that within a plan, I think, is really your first step. And then, so how do we determine the best technology strategies for the organization itself? And just on the next slide. So what are some of the trends driving cybersecurity forward? Sorry, Brittany, can we go back to the previous slide? I apologize. Oh, there we go. Okay, now I'm set. Page 4. Now we're back. But so on the fourth slide, just I wanted to point out a few different things as it relates to the looking forward. So if you can switch to the next slide, please. There you go. There we go. So there are 3 things I wanted to mention on this slide, and it's just trends and what is driving the cybersecurity forward. First is a concept called zero trust. And really what that means is never trust anything. Never trust a request that seems odd. Never click on a link that you may not be comfortable with. Never ever trust, always verify. And this becomes more important when you've moved to the cloud. And because we're moving to the cloud, do you really know where all of your sensitive data is? Do you know where you could obtain your data and how it's being housed and the safety of it? Second part of it is threat management. So you're going to need to somehow locate any suspicious entries into your system itself. So that means you need to continuously monitor. You need to take immediate action. So it's 24/7 monitoring of these potential threats. And then finally, updating systems. Companies are bringing their organizations into the 21st century, right? And I think it sounds kind of odd that we're 22 years in, but there are still a lot of companies, and it's not uncommon, that have on-premise systems, antiquated systems, and we have not quite moved all of our data to the more nimble and wider spaced cloud systems that we have today. So that means that we need to really have a new approach to assess what your cyber risk versus cyber risk cloud versus what your on-premise approach is. Has to be different. And on the next slide, what does a successful security framework look like? And I'll break it down into several aspects here. The first is identification, right? So understand where your areas of risks are, understand where the company's key assets are, both physical and software assets, and just understand what you have, tag everything, and identify where your risks may be. Number two is to protect your data. And you're going to need to have some sort of identification management or limited access, whether remote or people are on site, but that's something that is going to be key to protection of your data. 24/7 supervision, as I mentioned earlier, and something we don't often talk about, but is spreading the awareness among employees about what their duties are, what their responsibilities are for cybersecurity. It seems intuitive that if you saw something that came in that kind of looks like spam or kind of looks like you've never heard from the CEO of your company before, and maybe there's a phishing attempt and the CEO said, hey, listen, I need you to transfer X amount of money from our bank accounts. Most people wouldn't click on the link, or most people wouldn't respond, but you do need to educate others because people are busy. People may just inherently decide that it comes from the executives, and therefore I will just answer and I will just go ahead with what the instructions are. So you really need to train people on a more frequent basis and understand that they do have a duty to protect the company's data. And that means acting on when something seems a little bit off, when they may see a potential breach of data, go immediately to your IT department. Then detection, right? So even though you may have a robust framework in place, like we talked about earlier, cyber attacks are still going to occur. And we're going to need to detect where it is, but also prepare what I call an after attack protocol, just to minimize damage. So that means that once this happens, once you find out that there's a cyber attack, you need to ensure that you have specific steps to be taken immediately afterwards. And that's what response is on the next one. You have to have a rapid response time for any of the actions. What you do immediately is implement your after attack protocol, right? Who do you call first? What has to happen? What systems get closed? What software do you need to run? Do you need to inform law enforcement, right? If it's something that's considering that it's some of the example I had earlier when it relates to investments, yeah, you may need to call law enforcement very, very quickly. So what is your protocol? What are your steps to do that? Do you need to go out to the media? Do you need to say to the media, hey, listen, I'm a streaming company. All 9 million of our customers may have had their data compromised. You're going to have to go out to the press and explain that. So issuing a press release. These are things that you have to consider when you have a response. And then finally, it's recovery, right? what do? How do you restore order immediately and effectively as possible? How do you get back up and running right away? And then what did you learn from it? Highlight the changes and ensure that you have what you need to improve the overall security framework. So before we move on, I do have a few questions here. So the first one is, how would you enforce the use of complex passwords in your accounting department? We change our passwords monthly, and I think that's something that's important. It's a combination of numbers, characters. I think it's up to 12 characters at this point, but it's 12 total characters for a password. So that's something that has to happen. Otherwise, you get locked out of the system. You'll get warnings. Otherwise, you'll get locked out of the system. You won't be able to post your journal entries, for example, or run your consolidation. Another question is, IT and finance can only become effective through good communication, and how would you improve this? That's a great question. I think it's something that we work through very frequently. It's something that I meet with the CISO and other leaders within the IT department on a very frequent basis. I have several standing meetings, some on implementation. So I have biweeklies on implementation. I have status reports every other week. We prepare board materials together. So to continue to build those relationships is extremely important in order to enhance that type of communication. Okay. So on the next slide, we just want to talk a bit about how to determine the best technology strategies for your organization. And this here is just a flow chart to explain sort of what you should be thinking through when you're determining your technology strategies. And the first is the business drivers. You need to articulate that. And I think the IT department and their teams are going to need to document the key business drivers, right? What are your key business drivers specific to your organization? And depending on the organization's size and focus, I mean, you could be a not-for-profit, for example, they could capture those drivers by talking with other senior leaders and the board and ensuring that we understand where the drivers are using your financial statements, but also walking them through that. So that's another thing that I should have mentioned earlier. When we talk about communication, one of the things that I am in habit of doing is on a quarterly basis, I walk through the financial statements with various departments, including IT. So I present to the CISO just so they have an understanding of what our business drivers are. And I think it doesn't seem that it's something that others are not doing, but it's pretty often skipped. It's pretty often that finance doesn't listen or is not able to take the time to walk the IT department through your financial statements, because it provides them with a good understanding of all the different intricacies of your systems and what's important and how it's important, and really what drives our businesses. What are the front end sales? What are our billing practices? So very important to do that. And it's crucial for the CIO, the CISOs to articulate the business drivers, because the technology principles themselves depend on them. So they have to be able to talk finance as well as finance talk IT. And then you need to be able to convey all of that to your senior leadership, to your board, and to your staff and the employees as a whole, which will involve a little bit of digging into the strategy, but also provide people with a better, more robust understanding of what the framework is. And I think just one other top point on the business drivers, I think, what does a CISO need to know? What does a IT personnel need to know? I mean, are you improving profitability through how? Reducing costs, driving revenue, employee productivity are things that you want to take a look at as well. But these are all the types of things where you just go from the financial statement level, but dive down a little bit more to explain to the CISO and their teams what the importance are. Next step here is the technology principles. So you're going to select them. And once you've documented what your drivers are, the technology team could then start designing and articulating what the principles are that are going to be enabling those business drivers. So I think when you talk about, sometimes you talk about efficiency and agility, that may mean that you may be using some software systems that are within the cloud. You may be moving to the cloud for many different reasons. And that's something that needs to be considered. You need to enable those business drivers that were articulated in the previous step. It doesn't have to be a one-to-one type of ratio, but each principle itself needs to somehow enable at least one business driver in order to be able to appropriately support the business. And I think, I would say here that you would also encompass all strategic technologies. So regardless of what you're using to put your financial statements together, for example, you really need to look at all of your strategic technologies when you're talking through with the CISO. Next step here, I would say, is really fleshing out the strategy, the architecture, the roadmap. They have, when you hit here, this is critical because this is where the CISO or the chief information officer are now able to understand the whys. Why are we doing this? Why is this important? What is our goal? What are our operational strategies? So for example, if the goal is to overall migrate your ERP to the cloud, your chief information security officer may have to articulate that we're developing, for example, a cloud center of excellence. That's really the next step. So now I'm putting together a cloud center of excellence. I'm really putting together a forming of what my framework should look like. And then of course, when, right? That's always the one. When are we doing it and why are we hitting this date? Why is it important to hit certain dates? Will support be no longer available for certain types of software? And it's just things like that need to be put together. So the strategy, the architecture itself, and the roadmap, it's going to require some thought and maybe deeper level of detail than you may be used to, but it's something that needs to be completed within a report, preferably, and that's something that should be taken, have the board understand, just so that we know where to go. And then finally, the vendor product selection. What are you going to, who are you going to decide on? How are you going to decide on your specific vendors? How are you going to decide on your specific products? It's critical that the selection happens at the conclusion of developing the strategy, not before. Because if you go willy-nilly and start hiring some vendors and buying additional products, if it doesn't fit into your overall strategy that you have mapped out, including your business drivers, you're going to run into some issues. You may be prioritizing inappropriately. So it's really important to hit all of these steps before you get to your vendor or your product selection. And then finally, the decisions, while it should be done in partnership with finance and IT, I think I would lean a little heavier towards the chief information officer, the CISO, in order to finalize what the best type of technology and products are in order to achieve the company's goals. And that's why early on, you're providing to them what the business drivers are so that they understand it, right? So they're not going off on something that they know is great technologically, but doesn't help me in finance, and vice versa.
Great. Thank you so much, Louis, for such an insightful presentation. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this fantastic keynote. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Thank you.